I spent about 6 weeks on this one before I felt confident enough to write a single word. The starting point was a captured diary, the field notes of a Viet Cong deputy regimental commander named Nguyen Nam Hung, who spent days probing the Australian base at Nui Dat in June 1966, trying to find the gap every patrol base eventually has. Every patrol has a moment when someone is too tired. Every unit has a window in the dark hours when the sentries are exhausted and discipline loosens. Hung knew this. He'd exploited it against the South Vietnamese for years. But when he wrote about the Australians, he didn't write about finding that window. He wrote about his men getting shot while looking for it. That stopped me cold. So I started pulling on that thread. The after-action reports, the Canungra training records, the veteran interviews, the SASR patrol logs, the NVA and VC commander debriefs. What I found wasn't just about sleep. It was about a completely different philosophy of what it means to own the night in a jungle war. June 6, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. A small group of Viet Cong reconnaissance men moved through the rubber trees north of the newly established Australian position at Nui Dat. They moved the way they always moved, with patience, with practiced silence, reading the darkness the way experienced soldiers read a map. Their commander, Deputy Regimental Commander Nguyen Nam Hung of the 274th Regiment, had been probing Allied positions for years. He knew how this worked. You approach after midnight. You find the perimeter. You find the spot where the sentries aren't watching, where the fatigue has set in, where someone's head has dropped. And then you count the guns. Then you report back and the regiment comes. He'd done it against the Americans. He'd done it against the ARVN. He knew the rhythm of how Western armies slept in the jungle. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the Australians didn't sleep that way. Several of his men were wounded by Australian sentries that night. Not because they made noise, not because they were careless. They were professional soldiers. They were wounded because the Australians were awake, alert, watching, at 2 in the morning, on their 3rd straight week in the field. When I first read Hung's diary account of those reconnaissance missions, preserved in a captured document that Australian intelligence translated and archived, I sat back and thought, that detail alone is a story. Because here's what that detail means. Every army in Vietnam had sentries. Every army rotated men through watch rotations. But Hung had penetrated plenty of those perimeters. He'd found the gaps. He knew how to wait for exhaustion to do its work. The fact that he couldn't find that gap against the Australians, the fact that his men kept running into alert sentries at the hours when men should be at their lowest, that wasn't luck. That was a system. And it was a system that had been forged not in Vietnam, but in the jungles of Malaya a decade earlier, by men who had learned the hard way what the jungle's darkness could do to you if you weren't ready for it. This is the story of that system. It's the story of why the Viet Cong called Australian patrols the Ma Rung, the ghosts of the jungle. And it's the story of why a doctrine built around strategic rest deprivation in a war zone turned out to be one of the most psychologically effective weapons the Australians brought to Phuoc Tuy Province. When the Americans arrived in Vietnam in force in 1965, they brought with them the most powerful military logistical system the world had ever seen. They brought helicopters and artillery and air conditioning and resupply drops at lunchtime. They brought the assumption, understandable given their experience in World War II and Korea, that a well-rested soldier was a more effective soldier, and that the job of command was to protect the men's recovery time wherever possible. The U.S. Army's field doctrine on patrol base operations was explicit about this. Soldiers required a minimum of 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep per 24-hour period, with 6 hours in sustained blocks considered the operational standard. The manual was clear. The body needs regular rest to restore physical and mental vigor. When a soldier is tired, his bodily functions are sluggish, and his ability to react is slower than normal. This wasn't laziness. This was sound military medicine. Sleep deprivation degrades cognitive performance, slows reaction times, and impairs judgment. Studies showed that soldiers getting fewer than 4 hours per night saw combat effectiveness drop by 15 to 25%. These were facts. And they were correct facts. The problem, and this is the thing that took me weeks to fully understand, was that in Vietnam's jungle war, applying those correct facts in the wrong context could get you killed. When I read through the accounts of American infantry units patrolling in 1966 and 1967, a pattern emerged. U.S. companies would set up patrol bases, establish a watch rotation, and the men who weren't on watch would sleep. That sounds rational. But in the deepest dark hours, what the military calls the black time, roughly between 1 and 4 in the morning, even the men on watch were fighting their circadian rhythms. In large bases, multiple men were watching multiple sectors. Noise discipline was difficult to maintain at scale. Movement happened, and the Viet Cong knew it. North Vietnamese military doctrine specifically analyzed American patrol patterns. Former NVA officers, interviewed after the war, described in detail how American units were predictable. They moved at certain speeds, they stopped at certain hours, they traded off watch in recognizable rhythms. The Americans were brave, one former VC commander told a researcher years later. But they made noise in the night. You could hear them, you could track them by their noise. American patrols talked. They moved to urinate. They coughed. They shifted their weight. Not because they were undisciplined, many were superb soldiers, but because their system didn't demand the same absolute stillness that the Australians imposed on themselves. General Westmoreland himself, when he grew increasingly frustrated with Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy through 1966 and 1967, was pressing them to be more aggressive. More fires, more movement, more contact. From his perspective, the Australians were moving too slowly, resting too cautiously, operating too quietly. In early 1967, Westmoreland formally complained to the Australian commander Vietnam, Major General Tim Vincent, demanding a more aggressive approach. The Australians, politely and firmly, refused. Reading through that exchange in the archival record, I kept thinking. Westmoreland was measuring the wrong thing. He was measuring speed and contact rates and body counts. What he wasn't measuring was what happened to the enemy in the darkness when they tried to probe the Australian lines, to understand why Australians slept the way they did in Vietnam and why it worked. You have to go back to Malaya, not as historical context, as the actual source code of everything that followed. In 1955, the 1st Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment arrived in Malaya to assist the British in suppressing the communist insurgency known as the Malayan Emergency. They were not the polished jungle warriors they would later become, but they were apprenticed to some of the best. They trained with Gurkha instructors who had been operating in that specific terrain against that specific enemy for years. They absorbed British jungle doctrine that had itself been beaten into shape by hard experience against guerrillas who were masters of ambush, night movement, and the exploitation of tired men. The central lesson of Malaya, the one that would travel all the way to Phuoc Tuy, was this. The night is not neutral ground. The insurgent's greatest advantage is that he can choose when to fight. He will always attack when you are at your lowest. So the question isn't how much sleep can you get. The question is, how do you deny him the window he's looking for? The answer was a rigid system built around two principles, the stand to and the watch rotation. At dusk, every evening, without exception, The entire patrol would come to full alert. Weapons ready, eyes on the perimeter, absolute silence. The stand-to lasted approximately 30 to 60 minutes, covering the critical transition period when the fading light gave an enemy the cover to begin movement without yet the full darkness that made him harder to hear. Then, through the night, a strict rotation meant that at least 1/3 of the patrol was always awake, more in high-threat areas. And at dawn, every dawn, another full stand-to. The half-light before sunrise was historically the most common time for attack, and Australian doctrine treated it with the same religious seriousness as dusk. When you do the arithmetic, the system explains the sleep math. A 6-hour tropical night in Phuoc Tuy. Sunset around 6, nautical twilight ending at 7, first light beginning at 5. Subtract the dusk stand-to. Subtract the dawn stand-to. Subtract the watch rotation. What remained for any individual soldier was a theoretical 4 hours, often broken, often interrupted by movement restrictions and noise discipline that prevented the kind of deep sleep the American system assumed was possible. Colonel Ted Sarong, who commanded the Jungle Training Center at Canungra from 1955 and later served as Australia's first military advisor in Vietnam, built this discipline into the marrow of every soldier who rotated through pre-deployment training. Sarong understood, and this was his genius in my reading, that the purpose wasn't simply to keep men awake. It was to make wakefulness a habit of mind. A Canungra-trained Australian soldier didn't need to be told to be alert at 2 a.m. He expected to be alert at 2 a.m. His body had been conditioned to it. His unit culture demanded it. When I found accounts of the training program, the 3 weeks of physical and mental hardening, the night ambush exercises, the deliberate sleep deprivation regimens, what struck me was how explicitly it mirrored what the Malayan experience had taught. 10,000 Australian soldiers per year rotated through Canungra as Vietnam expanded. Every one of them left understanding that in the jungle, fatigue is the enemy's ally. The Americans had no equivalent. They arrived with the doctrine of 7 to 8 hours recommended and 6 hours minimum. The Australians arrived with a doctrine that said, in a jungle where the enemy owns the night, you share the night with him, and you make that sharing cost him everything. October 1966. A Viet Cong infantry company from D445 Battalion was moving through the rubber plantation country south of Long Tan. 2 months earlier, D Company of the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment had fought 1,500 Viet Cong soldiers to a standstill in that same plantation. 18 Australians against an entire regiment, holding through a monsoon rainstorm while ammunition ran down to the last magazines. The VC had lost 245 confirmed dead. It was a shock, but it hadn't broken them. What the Viet Cong commanders were now discovering was something more insidious than a single battle. Their patrols were running into Australian ambushes at all hours of the night, not just at dusk, not just at the predictable windows they had learned to exploit against other forces. These ambushes were waiting for them at 2 a.m. and at 3 a.m. and in the gray nothing before dawn. Ambushes set by men who, by any reasonable calculation, should have been approaching the edge of exhaustion. But they weren't. Or if they were, it didn't show in their trigger fingers. A statistical analysis of one ATF ambush data published decades later by Australian military historians lays this out in remarkable numbers. Australian ambush positions in 1966 and 1967 clustered at 2 peak windows, around 8 p.m., shortly after nightfall, and then again in the pre-dawn hours. Exactly when Viet Cong resupply patrols were trying to get back from the villages into the jungle before first light. The Australians had mapped the enemy's rhythm, and they had built their own alert posture to be sharpest exactly when the enemy was most likely to be moving. Ambushes represented 36% of all 1 ATF contacts. Their own kill-to-casualty ratios in those ambushes were extraordinary. But the numbers alone don't tell you what it felt like to be on the receiving end of it. I found testimony from a former Viet Cong regional commander recorded in a post-war research interview that stopped me mid-read. He described the Australians this way. You could not predict them. They were not like the Americans. The Americans, we could track them. We could hear them at night, find their routines. The Australians, they moved like water. And at night, they were always there. We called them Ma Rung, ghosts of the jungle, because they seemed to move without sleeping. Without sleeping. That phrase sat with me. Now consider what it means in operational terms. In September 1966, an SASR patrol operating in enemy-controlled territory in Viet Cong Province had been in the field for 11 days, 4 to 6 men. They had covered their patrol area through triple canopy jungle, moving during daylight at a rate of movement so slow that observers later compared it to geological drift. Sometimes 400 meters in a full day, and every night the same system. Dusk, stand to. Watch rotation, dawn, stand to. No fires, no conversation, no meaningful rest. By day 11, these men were functioning on a cumulative sleep debt that would have floored most people. But their sentry rotations were holding. Their ambush positions were set. When enemy movement came in the pre-dawn of day 12, the patrol responded with controlled, accurate fire that simulated, by the volume of it, a force 3 times their size. The SASR patrol extracted without a KIA. The enemy did not. Over the 6 years of SASR deployment in Vietnam, the regiment conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They killed 492 confirmed enemy and took 11 prisoners. Their own losses in combat: 1 killed in action, 1 against 492 confirmed enemy dead. The kill-to-loss ratio that emerges from that data is almost incomprehensible, and a significant part of it traces directly to the ability to maintain alert, functioning, dangerous patrol postures at the hours when the enemy believed you would be spent. That was what those 4 hours bought them. Not rest, exactly. Control. The ability to be the sharpest people in the darkest hours. That's not endurance. That's a weapon. By 1967, the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy had begun to adapt. They had to. Every insurgency does. The patterns of contact that had worked against other forces were failing against 1 ATF, and the D445 Battalion, the provincial main force unit, was absorbing the evidence in blood. Their first adaptation was timing. If Australian ambushes were peaking at 8 p.m. and in the pre-dawn, the VC began pushing resupply movement into the dead middle of the night. The 1 to 3 a.m. window, where they assumed even the Australians would be at their lowest. What they found instead was that the Australians had anticipated this. The watch rotation system meant there was no predictable low point. 1/3 of the patrol was always awake, and the sentry on watch at 2 a.m. was as alert as the sentry at 9 p.m. Not because he was superhuman, but because the system had prepared him for it, and the unit culture held him to it. On the Australian side, the infantry battalions were refining the practice in real time. By 1967, the standard operating procedure had evolved to require noise and light discipline, so absolute that soldiers on multi-week patrols did not cook food, did not use a torch, and communicated through a system of hand signals and touch that functioned in complete darkness. One veteran of 7 RAR recalled that on a 3-week patrol, he ate cold ration food for 21 consecutive days and spoke fewer than 200 words, and those only in the most compressed tactical whispers. When I first read that account, I initially thought it was an exaggeration. Then I found similar descriptions from 5 RAR, from 6 RAR, from the SASR logs. It wasn't an exaggeration, it was policy. "We didn't sleep," a veteran of 1 RAR told an interviewer years later. "You never quite slept. You were always listening. Even when it was your rest period, part of you stayed tuned in. After a few weeks, you didn't know any other way to be." That state, call it hyper-vigilant rest, was something the Australian system had deliberately cultivated. It was a psychological condition as much as a physical discipline. Men who'd been through Canungra and several tours in Borneo and Malaya before Vietnam arrived, already carrying the mental architecture for it. NASHOs, National Servicemen, absorbed it from the veterans in their units. The platoons became self-reinforcing systems. No one relaxed. Not at midnight. Not at 3 a.m. The culture didn't permit it. Meanwhile, the NVA, the People's Army of Vietnam, the Northern regulars who began arriving in Phuoc Tuy in larger numbers from 1967 onward, brought a different caliber of soldier to the problem. NVA commanders were trained, disciplined, and experienced. They analyzed the Australians with genuine professional respect. Former NVA officers interviewed after the war described briefings in which Australian patrol habits were discussed explicitly. Their slowness of movement, their night discipline, their unpredictable ambush positions. "We were told," one former officer recalled, "that the Australians slept in shifts but did not truly sleep. We were told to treat them as always awake." The NVA response was to avoid the Australians where possible, which had the perverse effect of handing one ATF exactly what Australian doctrine wanted: control of the ground through patrol dominance rather than fire dominance. By the late 1960s, Australian forces had established something that General Westmoreland had never asked for and couldn't quite categorize: a psychologically controlled territory, not held by firepower, held by presence, by the certainty in the minds of every VC and NVA commander in Phuoc Tuy that somewhere out there in the dark, right now, Australians were awake and watching. The Anzac battalions that integrated New Zealand soldiers with Australian units from 1968 onward absorbed the same culture. New Zealand veterans of the NZSAS, who had served alongside Australian SAS from late 1968, later described the system with precision. Stand to, rotation, dawn to dusk alertness as the governing rhythm of existence in the field. "You ate when you could," one said. "You slept when the rotation allowed it. You weren't sleeping enough by any normal measure. But you weren't the target either." By 1969 and 1970, the cumulative effect of 5 years of patrol discipline had produced something remarkable. One ATF had, for all practical purposes, broken the Viet Cong's ability to operate freely in Phuoc Tuy Province. The numbers tell the story precisely. From June 1966 to September 1971, one ATF recorded at least 3,370 enemy killed in Phuoc Tuy, the vast majority in the infantry contacts and ambushes that were the product of the patrol system. Highway 15, the main supply route through the province, was open to unescorted civilian traffic by the early 1970s, a metric of pacification that almost no other province in South Vietnam achieved during the war. The D445 Battalion, the VC main force unit that had mortared Nui Dat and fought at Long Tan, had been ground down to a fraction of its combat capability. VC leadership in the province was increasingly unable to collect rice taxes, recruit in the villages, or move their units at night with the freedom they had once taken for granted. What had done this wasn't primarily firepower. When I mapped the contacts against the patrol activity records, the pattern was unmistakable. The dominant mechanism was presence, specifically nocturnal presence, the ambush program, the sentry rotations, the willingness to spend weeks in the jungle on reduced sleep, maintaining a level of alertness that the enemy had calculated was impossible. Journalist Neil Davis, who spent a decade covering the war in Vietnam and Cambodia, reflected on the Australian performance in 1983. "I was very proud of the Australian troops. They were very professional, very well trained, and they fought the people they were sent to fight. They tried not to involve civilians, and generally there were fewer casualties inflicted by the Australians." Former U.S. Special Forces Commander David Hackworth, a man not known for easy praise, put it differently. "The Aussies used squads to make contact and brought in reinforcements to do the killing. They planned in the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could do anything." What Hackworth was describing, without naming it precisely, was the downstream effect of patrol discipline. A unit that trusted its night routine could operate in smaller elements, more confidently, in more aggressive positions. The SASR patrols of 4 to 6 men who were holding ambush positions at 2 a.m. in enemy-controlled Viet Cong province were doing so because they knew, not believed, knew that their watch rotation would hold, that the man beside them was not asleep, that the man behind them was listening. The SASR kill ratio in Vietnam is worth returning to one more time, because I want to sit in it for a moment. 492 enemy killed, 1,200 patrols, 1 combat death of their own. When I first encountered that number, I spent an embarrassing amount of time checking it against multiple sources, because it seemed impossible. It is not impossible. It is the product of small unit mastery, certainly, of tactical skill and training and extreme courage. But it is also, at its foundation, the product of men who had fundamentally solved the problem of the dangerous night. They were there, in the dark, every night, functional, lethal, and entirely unpredictable. The enemy never found the window, because the window never existed. At the height of Australian operations in 1969, a former Viet Cong district commander from Phuoc Tuy Province gave a remarkable debriefing to Australian intelligence. He had defected. He explained that his forces had begun avoiding areas where SASR patrols were suspected to be operating, not because they had been defeated in battle, but because the uncertainty had become insupportable. His men did not know when the Australians were sleeping. He had concluded that they might not sleep at all. That psychological control, that fog of uncertainty about when the ghost would strike, was, in his assessment, more destructive to his unit's morale than any number of firefights. He was describing, without knowing it, exactly what Colonel Ted Sarong had designed at Canungra in 1955. The Australians withdrew from Phuoc Tuy in December 1971. Within months, the Viet Cong began moving back into the province. The structures they had built, the roads open to civilian traffic, the VC infrastructure dismantled village by village, did not survive the Australian departure and the eventual fall of Saigon in 1975. In that sense, it was a war they couldn't ultimately win. But what was won, what remains a genuinely consequential episode in military history, was the proof of a doctrine. The proof that in a jungle counterinsurgency, the side that truly owns the night controls the tempo of the war. The Australians provided instructors to the USMA CV Recondo School and to the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol Training Wing. American LRRP units who trained with Australians or alongside SASR patrols consistently noted the difference in movement discipline, in noise discipline, in the particular quality of alertness that Australian soldiers maintained through the night. The lesson didn't fully penetrate the American system in time to change the war. The institutional inertia was too great, the doctrinal commitments too entrenched. Westmoreland's system of search and destroy, body counts, and big unit firepower had its own logic, and it ran too deep to be redirected by the example of a small force in one province sleeping 4 hours a night and haunting the darkness. But the lesson was learned eventually. Elements of Australian patrol doctrine, the stand-to system, the rotational alertness requirements, the emphasis on movement slowness and noise discipline in counterinsurgency environments, became embedded in Commonwealth Special Forces training and, through that lineage, influenced the doctrine of modern Western Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. When I started pulling this story apart, I thought I was researching a technical detail of military doctrine, sleep schedules, watch rotations, the mechanics of patrol base administration. What I found was something different. A story about how a nation's army learned, through painful experience in Malaya and the jungles of Borneo, that the most important weapon in a guerrilla war isn't firepower. It's presence. And presence, in a war fought in darkness, requires that you never quite leave the night behind. The Viet Cong called them the ghosts of the jungle. They meant it as a description. It was also an epitaph for their own freedom of movement in Phuoc Tuy Province. Ghosts don't sleep. And for 5 years in the rubber plantations and deep jungle of South Vietnam, neither did the Australians.